Geographic Information System, Surface Modeling, Digital Elevation Model. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to understand about surface models, digital elevation models, application of digital elevation models. Surface modeling is a method of showing or representing solid objects. The process requires you to convert between different 3D modeling types, such as converting the 3D object to show the procedural surface, validate imperfections and apply smoothness. Surface modeling is a representation of a geographic feature or phenomena that can be measured continuously across some part of the Earth's surface, for example, elevation. And surface model is an approximation of a surface generalized from a sample data. Surface models are stored and displayed as raster, tins or terrains. A 3D surface model is a digital representation of features, either real or hypothetical, in three-dimensional space. Some simple examples of 3D surfaces are landscape, an urban corridor, gas deposits under the earth, and a network of well depths to determine water table depth. These all are examples for real features, but surfaces should be derived or imaginary. An example of a derived surface is the contaminating levels of a particular bacteria in each well. Those contaminants could be mapped as a 3D surface too. Imaginary examples of 3D surface are often the types found in video games or computer simulation environments. ArcGIS can create and store 4 types of surface model: raster, triangulated irregular network, tin, terrain dataset, and LAS dataset. These surface models can be created from a variety of data sources. The two main methods of creating surface model are interpolation and triangulation. There are several interpolation methods to create raster surface, such as inverse distance weighted, spline, kriging, and natural neighbor. You can build triangulated surface by creating a tin, terrain dataset or LAS dataset. A functional surface is a continuous field of values that may vary over an infinite number of points. For example, points in an area on an Earth surface may vary in elevation, proximity, or a feature or concentration of a particular chemical. All these values may be represented on the z-axis in the 3-dimensional x, y, z coordinate system. So, they are often called z-values. GIS data can generally be categorized into 2 major types: raster and vector. Vector data is defined by points, lines and polygons and their associated relationship that comprise geospatial data. Real world features and surfaces can be represented as vector data stored in a GIS. Raster data is a rectangular matrix of cells represented in rows and columns. Each cell represents a defined square area on the Earth's surface and holds a value that is static across the entire cell. A surface can be represented as raster data, where each cell is the data represented some value of real world information. It could be elevation data, contamination, concentration, water table level and so on. Raster data can further be subdivided into categories such as thematic, pictures or continuous data. Surfaces represented as raster data are form of continuous data. Continuous data is also referred to as a field, non-discrete or surface data. A continuous surface represents phenomena in which each location on the surface is measure of the concentration level or its relationship from a fixed point in space or from an emitting source. The location precision of the individual feature, for example, the summit of a mountain, is directly related to the size of the grid cell. In the example, a very coarse elevation surface data is depicted as the surface model in the two-dimensional planar view. Raster surfaces can be generated and modeled with other image sources for 3D perspective views, as well as such as this high resolution DEM with hill shade. A raster surface is a continuous field of value that may vary over an infinite number of points. For example, points in an area may vary in elevation, proximity to a surface, proximity to a feature, or concentration of a particular chemical. Any of these values may be represented on the z axis in 3-dimensional xyz coordinate system to produce a continuous 3D surface. Digital elevation model (DEMS) in its most generic term implies elevation of a terrain devoid of vegetation and man-made features. It represents the elevation of the Earth's surface in the form of a digital image, where each pixel contains an elevation value of the center point of the pixel. Digital elevation model are a primary input to any modeling or processing quantification involving the Earth's topography and are used across several areas of development. For instance, in the water resource management, the Earth's surface determines water flow. The term digital elevation model is a generic description for digital imagery of elevation, topography, or bathymetry. It is digital in the sense that digital elevation model most often are produced, distributed, and analyzed in soft copy or electronic format. It describes the elevation of the ground surface exclusive of man-made structures, vegetation, or any other objects above ground. Finally, it is a model in two senses. First, a digital elevated model is a pixel-based modeled representation of the Earth's surface, where each pixel of a digital elevated model represents an elevation value. And second, computers or algorithms can use a digital elevation model as input to model or analyze 3-dimensional topography. The potential of digital elevation models to derive actual ground height and height above the ground has far-reaching application with broad practical and analytical utility. However, the quality of a DEM, especially in terms of spatial resolution or cell size, accuracy, and completeness, has critical implication for the usefulness of the resulting application or information. Water resource management. Hydrology represents the flow of both ground and the surface water through the ecosystem. Bathymetry represents underground water topography. Below, the typical digital elevation model application for hydrological modeling and bathymetric mapping. Water catchment or watershed mapping. A water catchment, also called as a watershed or drainage basin, refers to the spatial extent of an area of land where surface water from rain, melting snow, or ice drain to a single outflow point at a lower elevation. Since the shape of the earth governs water flow, a digital elevated model is extremely useful identifying the flow channels, connecting these channels in the form of stream networks, and as a result delineating catchment areas. Catchment maps such as floodplain characterization, digital elevated models are critical for characterizing the floodplain, that is, the geographical extent of low-lying land areas that will be subject to flooding above certain thresholds. Having assessed flow channels and connected them in stream network to form a catchment area or watershed based on ground morphology. Digital elevated models can portray the associated floodplain. This is discussed in the detail under disaster risk management. Stormwater management. Stormwater managers rely heavily on digital elevated models for monitoring and modeling watersheds, streams or other flow channels. Digital elevation models can track hydrological processes such as modeling the water volume flow during peak rainfall events and hydrological processes, that is, modeling where that water will flow or how storm water will interact with structures such as culverts and bridges. In concert with canal morphology modeled from digital elevation models and associated remote sensing, data on existing structures can be collected from municipal maps or from digital elevated models remote sensing sources. A high spatial resolution color camera example used in LiDAR can add data classifying structures by height, shape, which more completely informs storm water flow and interactions across the landscape. This use of digital elevated models is often focused on urban areas, but the channel morphology interacts with man-made structures in rural environments as well. Wetland mapping. Wetlands are characterized by their morphology, their location within the landscape and the vegetation species that live there. The concept of context, shape and vegetation type are critical importance when it comes to delineating wetland. Photogrammetry has been used extensively to detect boundaries between land and water and by extension wet versus dry, plant versus no plants. So, while a digital elevated model is insufficient on its own for mapping densely vegetated wetlands, the fusion of digital elevated structures and photogrammetry's color information can both map wetlands and classify the associated species. Water supply and sanitation. Accurate topographical data is essential for water supply management and maintenance of hydrological and ecological services that provide water. High resolution, high accuracy digitally elevated models can be prerequisite for effective water supply and sanitation management, delineating watershed and catchment areas for wells and enable users to map how water flows through a landscape. Most commercial GIS software packages now have the ability to map watersheds based on an underlying digital elevated models. Disaster risk management. Three-dimensional data are essential for mapping and assessing disaster risk as well as preparing for responding to and preventing disaster. For example, terrain modeling and surveying for both exposed and below water topographies are increasingly being used to predict, map and manage storm and other natural disaster events. The focus of disaster risk management strategies is to increase awareness of risk reduction and response strategies, physically reduce the risk of property and landscape damage and loss of life, and to continuously increase community resilience to disasters. Digital elevated models are also important in disaster risk management in areas such as elevation related disaster risk, structural building damage, wildfire risk. Floodplain management approaches can use digital elevation models for real-time application as well as virtual flood modeling. Real-time flood monitoring and mapping lead to products such as estimated flood depth based on rainfall amounts, that is, which is derived from the meteorological data, or the flood extent or delineation that is derived from flood mapping via airborne imagery. Runoff modeling based on stream flow characteristics, for example, flow quantity, speed, turbulence given the rainfall and the terrain properties. Erosion or soil loss modeling, where digital elevated models and their inherent slope aspects, topographical information from one input to erosional models along with data on rainfall characteristics. For example, amount of rainfall, duration of rainfall, severity of rainfall, soil type and surface vegetation. Relocation strategies, where digital elevated models are essential for relocation planning and reduction of flood impacts on internal dispatched person camps. Geological applications. Digital elevated models are of significant use in the field of geology, geomorphology and geophysics. For examples include landform and geohazard mapping based on shaded relief maps that provide insights to, for example, illumination angles, contour maps, aspect maps or slope maps. Subsidence or fault mapping, that is seismic monitoring. Scientists and agencies that monitor seismic fault zone require digital elevated models of high spatial resolution and accuracy to monitor these areas. Ideally, digital elevated models should be constructed prior to any seismic event to establish a baseline for comparison to post-event topographical or survey data. Digital elevation models are essential for monitoring movement along such fault lines and for assessing damage after earthquakes or volcanoes. For example, significant vertical changes in the digital elevated models are indicative of subsurface instability. Rapid and frequent monitoring is essential in such destabilized areas, mainly because large-scale events have been correlated to recent landscape shifts and because in some instant the instability of landform actually lead to changes in datums and positions, resulting in digital elevated models inaccuracies. Coastal monitoring. Digital elevation models are used increasingly for coastal application due in large parts to technological advancement in monitoring and mapping and for assessing the coastal climate change impacts. Digital elevation model application in these environments are related to shoreline delineation, monitoring sea level rise, general coastal management, coastal engineering, mapping coastal indentation and underwater applications such as sea floor morphology and underwater archaeology. In coastal monitoring, digital elevated models especially form an integral part of defining shoreline delineation, sea level rise, coastal management, coastal engineering, coastal flooding, underwater applications. Transportation. Highly accurate surveys are required in the design and construction of road infrastructure. Often the 0.2 or 0.3 meter contour interval level. LiDAR and stereo photo surveys are commonly used for these kinds of tasks given their accuracy, precision and comprehensive coverage. Digital elevated models created with these remote sensing approaches are useful for planning, mapping and constructing roads as well as for optimizing construction vehicle roads and ensuring safer working conditions. Urban analysis. The use of digital elevated models, digital surface models and their criteria has become commonplace in urban environmental planning and infrastructure assessment. Typical applications include identifying building construction sites, assessing drainage structure and patterns in urban landscape, planning green landscapes such as golf courses or city parks and assessing roadway, bridges and other infrastructure conditions. Private and public sector organizations use digital elevated models to assess building volume and extent for insurances or tax purposes. Though most digital elevated models have a gap fill the ground structure beneath building footprints, usually by data interpolation. Digital surface model used for urban application also come in handy to access roof heights and possible impacts of flood events through submersion of structures. Agriculture application. Digital elevated models in agriculture are used primarily at the field or landscape scale. Farmers in developed and developing countries use the digital elevated models to inform planting and irrigated strategies. Example, to avoid waterlogged crops in depression or water-stressed crops on rugged, shallow soil outcrops. Digital elevated models are also used to develop contour farming strategies to minimize soil erosion and nutrient losses along the slope. At very fine scales, high-resolution digital elevated models can help inform management of high-value intensive crop, for example, vineyards, to ensure that each plant is ideally located or managed for optimal production. The use of digital elevated models in precision agriculture, for example, responding to inter and intra-field crop variability, is more limited, related mostly to hydrological mapping and monitoring. 3D visualization. Three-dimensional visualization overlaps with many of the common digital elevated model applications. For example, modeling, topographical analysis, landform development, contours, break lines, slope, curvature, among others. Ecological modeling. Digital elevated models are widely used for ecological application assessing ecosystem flora and fauna. Referencing any point relative to the ground requires an accurate digital elevated model, which scientists, modelers or managers can then use to analyze the landscape's vegetation structure. For example, the height of the vegetation, how much is the biomass or the canopy dimension, the carbon stored in the crop or the habitat. Habitat includes the canopy gaps, forage amount, etc. Drainage patterns, growth patterns, for example, carbon loss or gains, and fragmentation, which includes interconnectivity of animal ranges. Surface geological model is a complex task for geographic information system technology. However, the spatial nature of geo objects always drives the GIS to be part of modeling system. The traditional activities in which GIS is involved in geosciences are data management, visualization, spatial analysis. Current developments allow the full GIS capabilities on a desktop computer with full integration of the industry standard relation database management system, geostatistical functioning, 3D visualization, 3D geoprocessing and web-based mapping. Recent addition and modification to ArcGIS have made it capable of surfacing, contouring and 3D functions that were once available only within the Arc or Info environment. The spatial analysis extension provides the ability to generate grids and contours with a variety of data interpolation methods. Digital elevation models and digital surface models are digital representation of the Earth's surface. Almost all current geographical information systems have some capabilities to model, present, manipulate, analyze and visualize terrain and artificial surfaces. The rapid development of elevation data acquisition techniques has made it possible for the general public to access global and national digital elevated model databases at various spatial scales. This advancement will greatly encourage the application of digital elevated models in broader fields using analytical functions of digital terrain analysis to drive and extract geographical, hydrological and geomorphological parameters and features from digital elevation data.